Good morning, everybody. Let's bow for a minute of prayer. Father, your creation has been outstanding this week. Just gorgeous flowers and new spring plants growing, and the grass is green and hasn't been weathered by the hot summer months. We're so grateful that we can see you in our creation. And we know from our lesson today that even if we don't have the law, that God still expects us to understand that he exists, either in our conscience or in our creation. Please be with us here this morning as we continue to study the book of Nahum. In thy name we pray. Amen. Mm-hmm. Well, last week we established two important characteristics about the book that we've been studying. First of all, Nahum is a prophetic address on Nineveh, the capital city of Austria. I said that last Sunday. Assyria. And we'll talk more about it. That's really, really an interesting city. Nineveh at the time, in the centuries following, Nahum was a mighty and a feared enemy of Judah. And remember, its King Sennacherib, had control of Israel. So Israel had been conquered, the northern kingdom, and the king of Assyria had attacked Judah on a number of occasions, actually destroyed a bunch of cities in the southeastern portion of Judah, and also had taken cities in Gilead, which is that Gentile region east of the Jordan up near the Sea of Galilee. I guess you can see Gilead up there in between the Green, Ammon, and the Sea of Galilee. And they had actually laid siege to Jerusalem. Sennacherib did. It's a very interesting story, saved by God's intervention and the prayers of Hezekiah. The prophecy describes Nineveh's overthrow and Judah's joy in that overthrow. The second thing that we learn about the book is it gives us a glimpse into God's anger, and we've been talking about God's anger. It could be anger that was terrible, and it could also be personal, as it was directed toward King Sennacherib. God's jealousy was not like human jealousy. It was not selfish. His vengeance was rooted in justice. His towering wrath was based on truth. And his indignation, although intense, was based on facts. And typically when human beings get angry, they're selfish. They're not based on fact. They're based on injustice sometimes. And we also talked about God's anger being part of his attributes. You can't separate the God of love from the God of anger. It is still the same God. And he is obligated as a holy God, when he sees injustice and he sees sin, to react to it, and to react to it thoroughly. Now, it doesn't mean that he will react now. We know he's long-suffering, but we know that his heart is also generous and loving and merciful. Nineveh would fall because God was angry with the sin of their idolatry, with their brutality against their conquered nations, and also against his people, the nation of Israel and Judah. And notwithstanding their reversal of his grace that they had received at Jonah's preaching. Remember, Jonah in the century before had gone to Nineveh, preached. They had confessed, repented, turned toward God, their king, and now a century later they have reversed and gone back in the opposite direction. So let's start off the morning and look at the video of Nineveh. So that was the video again, and before we get started, I want to talk about Nineveh. I mean, Nahum was about the destruction of Nineveh, and for us, it's an ancient city. So what's the big deal? I'm just amazed at the stuff that I found out about this city, and we talk often about the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, and we talk about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And yes, but relatively speaking, Jerusalem was a small, powerful, walled, protected city. But in comparison to what Nineveh was at the time, it's just truly amazing. Nineveh was first settled around 6000 BC, and by 3000 BC had become an important pagan worship center for the goddess Ishtar. This is first mentioned, the city actually is first mentioned in Genesis. I didn't know this. Genesis chapter 10, interesting, verse 11, and I'll probably read a couple verses to get us into this. Ham, you remember, was one of Noah's sons, okay? And descendant of Ham, one of the descendants of Ham was Cush. And Cush, if you read Genesis chapter 10, verse 8, it says, Cush also fathered Nimrod, who was the first man on earth to be known as a powerful warrior. He was also a skillful hunter before God. That's why you often hear people say, so-and-so is like Nimrod, a skillful hunter before God. The center of his kingdom was in Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. All were located in the land of Shinar. From there, he traveled to Assyria and established the cities of Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, which lies between Nineveh and Calah, and that is one magnificent city. Did you know that Nineveh was mentioned in the book of Genesis, established by Nimrod? The area frequently changed hands over the centuries, as you can well imagine, until the Assyrians established their dominance and thought to be the first ones to actually surround the city with a wall. The city grew dramatically in size, grandeur, and fame under, guess who? King Sennacherib, who made it his capital. You want to know what he looks like? I didn't have the picture last Sunday, but this Sunday I do. This is a relief that they think of the king. Long beard, braided hair. Under Sennacherib's reign, the city was refurbished. Great walls with 15 magnificent gates protected the inhabitants. Many argue that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, I think I mentioned this week, were actually located in Nineveh. One of the Hanging Gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The library that was created there by Sennacherib's grandson held 30,000 inscribed clay tablets. The books of those times, we're talking 1668 BC to 1627 BC, 30,000 clay tablets. That would take a pretty large building to hold all that stuff. But that's all remarkable. Nineveh is near the city of Mosul, Iraq. We've all heard of Mosul, right? During the ISIS occupation, that was a big battleground on a number of occasions. About 700 BC, it was the largest city in the world, and it remained the largest city in the world for about 50 years. Sennacherib's palace had 80 rooms. It was 1,700 feet by 800 feet, 1.4 million square feet. of space. It would occupy, it's the same as 388 of my houses. My house, and I live in a pretty big house. It had 150,000 inhabitants and covered the city and covered over 1,700 acres. So this was a metropolis. This was huge for that period of time. And this is interesting too. Statues like this were often found at the entrance to the palace rooms. Statues like this weighed anywhere from 9 to 30 tons. I mean, we can't even imagine the majesty and the wealth involved in this city. I have a picture of one of the gates. We said there were 15 gates. This is mostly a reproduction of the Adad gate, one of the 15s. This gate was demolished by ISIS in 2016, and several others because they were considered blasphemous to Allah. There was a mosque that had the tomb of Noah. Now, we don't know if it was the tomb, but it was traditionally ascribed to Noah. That was torn down. There were a couple other things that were torn down by ISIS. So these pieces of antiquity were completely destroyed. The interesting thing is, during the fight for the throne among Sennacherib's grandsons, actually, the combined armies of Babylon, Mede, and the Persians destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC. So this city of 150,000 inhabitants, covering 1,700 acres, towers that sometimes stood 200 feet tall, were completely destroyed by the Babylonians. It's just to understand the magnificence of the city and the building that Sennacherib did, and then having it destroyed by Babylon is really interesting to me. At the height, it was probably one of the greatest intellectual and cultural centers of its time. The city was sacked and burned and became buried in the earth and uncovered and until about 1846, when archaeological excavations started unearthing some of the magnificence of the city. And the other interesting thing is that most of those antiquities that were unearthed, huge sections of the walls, statues like the one I showed you, were all carted off to the west and are in Western museums, British museums, French museums. I don't know that any of them have any in the United States, but most of those antiquities that were uncovered were carted off to the west. The impregnable fortress that we're talking about had a river flowing through it. Here's a copy of what archaeology, that's not right either, gives us the Medes and the Babylonians, the way they attacked the city was they dammed up the river, and then they released it, and it destroyed part of the wall, making it easy for the invading armies to enter the city after a 3-month siege. So these invading countries were God's instruments to loot this fabulous city, destroy its defenses, and kill its inhabitants and take them off as slaves. So as we get back into the book today, chapters 2 and 3, as the video told us, describe the invasion and the city's destruction. Chapter 2 describes the attack and exactly the way history tells us that it probably occurred, which is very interesting to me. Now, remember, this was written before the city was destroyed, so this is Nahum's prophecy on what's going to happen to the city, and we find that his prophecy is very similar in a lot of aspects to what actually occurred in history. In chapter 3, God addresses the city directly, spelling out the trouble that's in store for it. He says that Nineveh will be punished for 2 reasons: 1, for mistreating other nations, and 2, for their pagan religious practices. And so in doing so, we see another aspect of God's anger, his thoroughness. In other words, he does not allow anything. Once he takes action, he's very thorough in his results and what he wants done. God was jealous in chapter 1. He will judge in chapter 2. And although long-suffering, God will be just and explain why Nineveh must go away in chapter 3. So let's start chapter 2. In this vision that God gives Nahum, we see that God will do what he's going to do to destroy Nineveh. Watchmen on the city gates usually, as we said last week, look for good news, but in this description, in this poem that Nahum gives us, the watchmen see an army advancing, and the city is captured. So let's go to our first reading in Nahum, and I'm in chapter 2, and we'll read the first 10 verses. Nineveh, an attacker is moving in to scatter you. You had better guard your fortress. Keep watch up and down your streets. Strap your war belt around your waist and gather all the strength you can. God will restore all the glory given to Jacob. The new nation will reassemble the splendor of Israel in its day. Remember, Assyria had overtaken and had destroyed Israel. Although destroyers destroyed everything, even decimating every branch of Jacob's family tree. Remember, there were 12 tribes in the northern kingdom. Here comes your attacker's best warriors with gleaming red shields. The soldiers are in scarlet armor. Chariots gleam and flash like fire with their approach. They were carefully made, ready for battle. They taunt you by waving strong spears before you. See the chariots race each other up and down your streets, rushing back and forth through the city. How did the chariots get in? Through the open walls. How did the walls fall down? By the dammed up river that was released. They look like flaming torches. They dart like lightning bolts. Your king remembers the specially trained forces, but they can't get it together, stumbling as they march. So the defenders of the city are not able to respond. They run to protect the city wall and try to shield it from the attackers. Their resistance fails. The city gates at the rivers are thrown wide open, reference to the river, and the palace collapses in a resulting flood. A decree is set and goes out. Nineveh will be ransacked. She is stripped and will be carried far away from home. You can hear the young girls pounding their breaking hearts and moaning like terrified doves. Nineveh was a shimmering pool of water, filled to the brim in the days of her glory, but look, her soldiers are draining away. Stop, stop, the Assyrian commanders shout, but no one turns back. The destruction continues. The attacker commands, take all the silver, take all the gold. The supply is endless. After all, their treasury is full of stolen wealth. Every corner of the city is turned upside down, ransacked, stripped bare. She will lose all hope. Her knees give way, and she will shake with fear and turn white as a sheet. That's a pretty descriptive description of what took place and what God has in store for the city. So the image of a lion, we got that too. This is taken from artifacts found in the city, but the image of a lion was often used by the Assyrians in their art and in their architecture. The Assyrians acted like lions as they stalked their enemies as prey and carefully devoured their captives. Lions normally would take their kill back to their lairs and provide only enough food for themselves and for their cubs, but the Assyrians amassed tremendous wealth beyond measure, and they did it at the cost of human lives. Nahum asked, as the city is destroyed, where is your lion den now? Where is all your prey, the treasures you ruthlessly took from others? And so I'm back in Nahum verse 11. Where now is Nineveh's famous and deadly lion's den, the place where they nourish their young lions into killing machines, the place where the lion and the lioness go, along with their cubs, to feed on the victims, the place where they had nothing to fear. The lion always kills enough for its cubs and struggles and strangles the prey for its mate, filling up the lair with the blood and bones and flesh of its kill, and its dens with fallen prey. And God says, I stand against you, Nineveh. I will command my heavenly army to burn up your chariots till the smoke rises up, and to consume your young lions with the sword. I will leave nothing in the land to sustain you. The voice of your messengers will never again be heard. That's a pretty gruesome scene that the prophet prophesies for this enemy of Israel and Judah, the city of Nineveh. So as we get into chapter 3, I got to say that God is long-suffering, but there comes a time when his hand of judgment falls. Nahum gives 3 reasons why Nineveh deserves to be judged. Number 1, the Assyrians were clever diplomats who lied to other nations. Then they broke their promises and then destroyed them. They tried to make, Israel, I think, tried to make pay tribute to Assyria, but that didn't work. They came in and completely destroyed the city and Samaria, its capital. They slaughtered people without regard to age or sex and stacked up corpses like lumber as a warning to others. There are some really gruesome tales about how Assyria treated the people that they conquered. Shedding of innocent blood is a serious sin to God, and he remembers and judges that. There are many examples in the Bible to back this up. So we're talking about God's concern for the innocent. And I've got three verses in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament that talk about this particular aspect of God's anger. And the first one is in Deuteronomy. You know, I have a problem. It seems like I have a problem pronouncing that. Deuteronomy. I want to say Deuteronomy. So it's in verse 19 of Deuteronomy, and it's part of the Mosaic Law, and it talks about God's response to innocent people. And the law reads, verse 11, but someone who does hate another person, who ambushes and kills that person, can escape revenge by fleeing to one of these cities. He's talking about refuge cities that were established throughout the kingdom when Joshua eventually took place and conquered the country. The elders of the city must send representatives to bring the killer back and turn him over to the blood avenger. There was somebody in the family that was designated to avenge whatever wrong took place. The relative of the murder victim who will kill him. Don't show any pity. You must remove the stain of innocent blood from Israel so that everything will go well for you. In other words, somebody who kills somebody else, kills somebody innocent, is a stain against the country. The next one is in 2 Kings, chapter 21. This is the story of Manasseh. Manasseh was a king in Judah, and he was particularly evil. Most of the kings of Judah were, as were the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom. Only Josiah and Hezekiah were actually 2 of the better kings. But 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 11. Manasseh, Judah's king, had committed even worse atrocities than the Amorites had committed before his time, and he also inspired wickedness throughout Judah because of his idols. Therefore, this is a message of God, Israel's God. Observe, I am going to infect Jerusalem and Judah with disaster. The ears of anyone who hears the sounds of this catastrophe will tingle. That's kind of an interesting word. I will judge the uprighteousness of Jerusalem by the same plumb line that I used in Samaria, and by the same level I used for Ahab's house. I will clean Jerusalem in the same manner that one cleans a dirty dish. I will wipe off the grime and flip the dish over and wipe off the underside of it as well. I'm going to relinquish what is left of my inheritance to the possession of their adversaries. They will be like stolen goods and vouching for their adversaries. This will take place because, and here's the point, this will take place because of all the wickedness that they have committed before me, and because of the anger they have caused to boil within me since the day their ancestors were delivered by me from Egypt until this very day. And here's the point. Manasseh killed countless innocent people and filled Jerusalem with their blood. And this is in addition to causing Judah to live sinful lives and committing evil in the Eternal's eyes. And the last example is Isaiah chapter 59, verse 2. And these are examples of God's anger over the shedding of innocent blood. Your persistent wrongdoing has come between you and your God, since you constantly reject and push God away. He had to turn aside and ignore your cries, for your hands are covered with blood. Your fingers are sticky with all manner of crimes. Your lips drip vicious lies. Your tongue mutters all manner of wickedness. Everyone misuses the judicial system, clogging it with twisted accusations and misleading testimony. With empty charges and baseless lies, they conceive trouble and give birth to injustice. You know, if you think about the countries of the world that do not have a independent and impartial justice system, there is no justice in the country. And the poor always suffer. You know, the downtrodden, the rich take over, the powerful take over, and they abuse power. And if the weak and lowly people of the country go to the justice system doesn't support it. It's not fair. And this is one of the things that Isaiah is talking about. They concoct and create the most poisonous things, as if they hatch viper's eggs or weave spider's webs. Eat their eggs and die. Crush one and a viper is hatched. Yet more poison, hurt, and distrust. There is nothing of value in their creation. The webs they weave are not fit to clothe or cover anyone. The products they make are nothing but trouble. Violence comes naturally to them. Their feet race to do evil. They rush to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are bent toward injustice, destruction, and trouble, the roads of their lives. So God gets angry at a lot of things, and one of the things that he gets angry at is the shedding of innocent blood, the injustice provided to people that don't deserve what happens to them because of the powerful. So heartless killing of innocent victims will one day answer to God, and I can't help but think of the people that are perpetuating that in Ukraine today. When it happens, it's going to happen, because God doesn't look away from things like that. So I'm back in Nahum, the first 3 verses of chapter 3. Hopelessness and despair, that's the destiny of the city that shed so much blood, that perfected its use of lies, that overflows with stolen treasures, leaving behind endless victims. The sharp crackling of the whip in the air, clattering of wheels on the street, galloping horse hooves, clanging, banging chariots, charging cavalry troops, flashing swords and gleaming spears, armies of casualties, piles of dead bodies, too many to count, so many you can't walk without stumbling over them. That's a pretty gruesome scene. The chief deity of Nineveh was Ishtar. I hesitated to find a picture of Ishtar that was modest enough that I could show in the Sunday classroom. So this was the best one that I could come up with. Most of the actual reliefs that show this goddess are pretty risque. She was the goddess of sexual passion, fertility, and war, and people become like the god they worship. And Nahum uses the metaphor of prostitution in the next verses to describe the Ninevites' idolatry. Nineveh spread this evil influence to other nations and enslaved them with their sorcery. God will expose the Assyrians and evil influence by spreading this pagan religion, and this wealthy, magnificent city will well become a heap of ruins, which we know that it was. It disappeared from the world for centuries until it was rediscovered by modern-day archaeology in the late 1800s. Chapter 3, verse 4. This is all because, and talking again about Nineveh, you tempted and lured the nations like a harlot, dangling the allure of immorality. You are a sorceress, promising control of the spiritual world, enslaving nations to lives of immortality and families to sorcery. God says, look at me and my armies. I will stand against you, Nineveh. I will treat you like the harlot you are, lifting your dress over your face, peeling back your outward facade, and exposing your true condition, your nakedness underneath. You will be humiliated and ashamed in front of the world. I'll throw all of your filth on you. I'll treat you with contempt and make a humiliating public display of you. Then the whole world will turn its back on you and flee, saying, poor, pitiful Nineveh, you are totally ruined. Is there anyone who will sympathize with you? Where will I find anyone to comfort you? So Nineveh didn't make any friends. Assyria didn't make any friends. And so when they are defeated by the Babylonians, there's no sympathy at all. There's nobody coming to their aid. They've alienated every nation of the world in doing so. So in the final verses of chapter 3, Nahum uses several images to show the Assyrians how their pride and self-confidence create weakness that will assure them of ultimate destruction. And Nahum begins with an historical example, Thebes, the capital city of Upper Egypt. Now, when they say Upper Egypt, they're talking about the source of the Nile, which is actually south, the southern portion of Egypt, and Lower Egypt, which is the delta area where it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea, is called Lower Egypt. So Thebes is the capital of southern Egypt, and that's typically where Cush, the country of ancient Egypt, existed before Egypt was unified, the north and south portion of Egypt, by some of the powerful pharaohs. It's also the way we help identify the period of time in which Nahum wrote his book. So if he talks about Thebes, that means it has occurred, which means he's written after that. And if he's talking about the destruction of Nineveh, that hasn't occurred yet, so we can pinpoint his writing between 662 BC, when Thebes was destroyed by Assyria, by the way, and 612 BC, when Nineveh was destroyed by the Babylonians. Thebes had a lot of allies, and it was sure in itself that it was safe. But in 663 BC, Assyria plundered Thebes and committed atrocities against its citizens that Nahum, the same atrocities that Nahum prophesies for Nineveh. In fact, Nahum says the victory of Babylon against Nineveh will be as easy as ripe figs falling from a tree into somebody's mouth. I don't know if I ever sat under a fig tree and waited for one to fall, but that's the image. He also says that the ferocious Assyrian soldiers will lose their strength and be like women, weak, afraid, and unable to oppose their enemy. Now, remember, we're talking about a masculine society in those days. So we've got women who serve in the armed forces nowadays, and I certainly wouldn't call them weak and afraid and unable to do their job in the services. But back then, that was a direct insult against the armies of Assyria. In the next image that Nahum gives us, Nineveh's enemies will sweep through the land like a plague of grasshoppers or locusts as they wipe everything out. We've talked about that image before in some of the other stories. Assyrians' leaders will be like locusts asleep on a wall on a cold day, only to fly away when the sun rises and heats up. And that's kind of the way locusts happen. In the colder weather, they're kind of dormant and lazy, but as the sun heats up, that's when they fly off and do their damage. Overconfidence in their safety like a sleeping locust, only to flee to safety when invasion arises. And Assyria, in his last image, was like a scattered flock of sheep without a shepherd. Nahum continues with another example. They had no allies to help them, and other nations will rejoice when they hear that Assyria is no more. And so let's finish off the chapter with verse 8. Are you any stronger than the city of Thebes in its glory days? Sitting at the edge of the Nile, its waters created a moat of protection on one side of her. The Red Sea was a perfect defense against her eastern enemies, as good as the protection of a wall. The bounty of the regions of Cush and Egypt supported her, and the areas of Put and Libya were her strong allies. So she felt pretty safe, but in fact Thebes was taken by the Assyrians despite all those. Yet she was taken captive and exiled. Her babies were broken to pieces at the crossroads of every street. They tossed lots into a bag and drew out names to establish control over honored men. All of her best and brightest were put to chains. And just like them, you will go into hiding, drinking, getting drunk to escape your terror, searching for some place to hide from your enemies. Then the second image. But those strongholds, Nineveh, are easy pickings, like figs on a tree. When they become ripe, just shake the tree and the pigs fall into your open mouth. Figs fall into your open mouth. And then the third image. Look at your fierce troops surrounding you now. They cower like untrained women, not like battle-hardened warriors. The gates that should have protected your land instead are standing wide open. Fire burns through the bars. Your enemies stroll right in. Draw up plenty of water to put out the fires and prepare for your enemy will begin a siege. Get busy working the clay and mud to make extra bricks. You will need them to repair holes punched in your walls. By the way, that's what the buildings were. That red gate that I saw you, those are made out of clay bricks. That's the way they built their buildings in those days. So can you imagine this palace of 1.4 million square feet made out of these bricks? And if you go and do some research on that, you'll see some of there's one of the gates that's just, I don't know how tall it is, but it's all covered in this blue mosaic with lions, and it's just, I mean, they built the foundation with the bricks, and then they decorated everything so that it was really amazing. Then the next one, the attacker's fire will consume you. Their swords will cut you down like grasshoppers attacking a field of grain, and they will totally consume you. Like grasshoppers, multiply yourselves like locusts, make your numbers countless. You brought so many merchants till they were more numerous than the stars in the sky. Like grasshoppers, they strip sustenance from the land, only to fly away before justice can be solved. Then another one. Your couriers are like locusts, your officials like swarms of locusts who become chilled against the wall on a cold day. When the sun comes up and they are warm, they will fly away, abandoning you. Searching, no one can find them. And then another image. O King of Assyria, your shepherds felt safe enough to sleep in the fields. Your leaders slept soundly in your city. When judgment comes, your people are scattered like lost sheep, far and wide among the mountains. There is no header, and there is no leader left to rally them together. Nothing and no one can heal your wound. Your city's wounds are fatal. You cannot survive. Everyone who hears the news of your destruction claps his hands in celebration, because who among them has not felt your legendary and endless cruelty? Well, let's see if I can summarize Nahum. As I said before, I find it really interesting how appropriate this book is in our society today and in the global situation that we find ourselves. Nahum emphasizes that God will punish cruel nations that follow inhumane policies and brutal practices. And we often kind of feel very frustrated that we see these things happening in the world and it doesn't seem like there's any repercussions. But in my own mind, God has not forgotten these countries. While it's genocide or exploiting the poor or supporting slavery or failing to provide people with the necessities of life, God knows these sins of national leaders and he eventually judges. I mean, it's easy to see Russia today as a current-day Assyria, as well as other autocratic nations that abuse innocent civilians. And at the same time, there's a consolation in God's reaction to such nations for the citizens of such countries like Ukraine. God's anger is unleashed in the defense of those he loves, and many of the refugees take refuge in God. And you saw a lot of that around Easter time, where the Ukrainians were back in church and not having a lot to be thankful for at the time, but you still saw the faith and the persistence of defending their countries. Certainly, they felt God's love, and they are trusting Him to make things right. And based on what we know about what the Bible says about these things, we can trust at some point God will take care of those people who cause innocent to suffer. That's what I got out of Nahum. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for the study of this book, and help us prepare for our next study, which will be Zephaniah. We pray for those innocent people throughout the world who are abused by the powerful and authority. We know that you recognize that is taking place, and eventually you will provide justice for those who are oppressed. We thank you for being our God. Please be with us throughout the rest of this week and bring us back safely again next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.